is Eric Stakelback.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. Well, it took President Obama exactly 1 year and 150 meetings with his cabinet members to finally come up with a nuclear policy on when and where and how the U.S. would use nuclear weapons. And I have to tell you, Michael, predictably, it's a disaster. Basically, the Obama administration's nuclear policy is the culmination of about 60 years, as Rudy Giuliani pointed out, about 60 years of left-wing fantasies. It's really unbelievable that an American president would take this posture, but I guess judging by what we've seen from the Obama administration so far in the foreign policy realm, we shouldn't be too surprised.
Exactly.
Now, you remember, Michael, last year in Prague, Obama made this pie-in-the-sky, head-in-the-clouds speech talking about a world without nuclear weapons. And he said the U.S. would take the lead in that initiative in forging a nuclear-free world. Hey, all of us want a world without nuclear weapons. That's all of our dreams, but it's just not reality. But President Obama this week, Michael, took a big step towards making that a reality, at least for the U.S. Basically, this new policy will see the U.S. only use nuclear weapons. And no one wants to use nuclear weapons, obviously. But in some cases, see Hiroshima, Nagasaki, it is necessary. But he wants to severely curtail the use of nuclear weapons to the most extreme cases.
What do you mean?
Now, President Obama is basically saying that if the U.S. is hit by a biological or a chemical or even a cyber attack, a really crippling attack, Michael, that could really just devastate a U.S. city, he's now saying that the U.S. will not react, will not respond with nuclear weapons, but will respond with only conventional weapons. Now, he says he's leaving the possibility open to retaliate against Iran and North Korea, countries like that, by nuclear means. But basically, he says he's not going to develop any new nuclear weapons, which is a big mistake, especially in this new war, this war against radical Islam. We need a lot of times smaller, more tactical nuclear weapons to bust through these bunkers, bust through places like Tora Bora, cave complexes. That requires some forward thinking in our nuclear arsenal. Now, that's off the table. So biological, chemical attacks, no nuclear response, no new nuclear weapons development.
That's crazy. Sorry, crazy.
He's kind of setting the standard for the world. He thinks if the U.S. takes the bull by the horns and becomes the first to disarm, to unilaterally disarm, then the rest of the world will follow suit. Unfortunately, this flies in the face of reality. You have a Russian regime right now that President Obama seems hell-bent on impressing and romancing, who the U.S. is working in tandem with now to reduce its nuclear arsenal. But the Russian regime says, and it is a regime. Under Vladimir Putin, it is a regime. Medvedev is basically a puppet. Putin is still pulling the strings in Russia. He's brutal, and that is a regime. The Russians say, hey, if we don't like this nuclear deal with the U.S., the START treaty, we can pull out. Now, as the U.S. is scaling back its nuclear arsenal, its possibility of a nuclear reactive strike, Russia is cutting huge weapons deals around the globe with rogue regimes. Vladimir Putin was in Venezuela last week, Michael. You saw the footage on the news, meeting with Hugo Chavez. The Russians are prepared to sell $5 billion in new arms to Venezuela. They're forging a new military alliance. Now, this is in our hemisphere. Hugo Chavez is in our hemisphere. The Russians are making inroads into our hemisphere, into our space. The Russians are also cutting weapons deals with the Saudis, with Syria, with Algeria, with Libya, and of course they're building the nuclear reactor in Iran. Yet while Russia is doing all of this and cutting weapons deals with China, by the way, major weapons deals with the Chinese, while they are doing all of this, the Obama administration is sending exactly the wrong message by actually scaling back our defensive capabilities.
Well, none of this is a surprise from him.
It's not that, if you remember back in the fall, the U.S. under Obama decided to scrap the missile defense shield in Eastern Europe. Now, this sent a message of weakness to Putin. This is a guy who you can't project weakness to, Michael. This is a KGB guy through and through is Vladimir Putin. Right now, he smells weakness. Not only does he and our enemies around the globe smell weakness, but our allies smell weakness. Under this new nuclear posture that Obama has announced this week, it also appears that the U.S. will do away with its tactical nuclear weapons arsenal in Europe. Now, we already sold the Eastern Europeans down the river back in the fall by doing away with the missile defense shield. Now we're going to sell Western Europe down the river. And I'll tell you, Russia is, under Putin, I think, has expansionist global ambitions, and Europe obviously is right at Russia's doorstep. If you don't have that nuclear deterrent to hold back Russia, you have a big problem there. So you have Iran and North Korea, which are nuclearizing. North Korea right now possesses nuclear weapons. The CIA said just last week that Iran right now, if it wants to, has the capability to produce nuclear weapons.
Oh, my God.
Right now, Iran smells weakness. And I think, Michael, that President Obama, and especially judging by his really third world treatment of Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House last month, I think President Obama has come to grips with the possibility of a nuclear Iran. I think he's willing to accept a nuclear Iran. When he talks about sanctions, quote, with bite, what does that mean? It's nonsense. He needs to talk about crippling sanctions. But at this point, Michael, it doesn't matter. Nothing, and I mean nothing, will stop Iran from its drive for nuclear weapons short of military action. I firmly believe that. Sanctions will not work. You are dealing with a genocidal, suicidal Iranian regime that has no problems, and they've said this, Michael, they have no problem sacrificing millions of Iranian civilians for the greater goal of wiping Israel off the map. They will fire a nuke at Tel Aviv, taking out 80% of Israel's population at Tel Aviv metro area. They will do that, and they will sacrifice, say, 20 million Iranians in an Israeli response. Remember, this is a country of 70 million people, very young country. Iran is willing to take that trade-off for the greater good, in their eyes, of wiping the Zionist entity off the map. And this is a regime, Michael, that during the 1980s showed us quite clearly the value they had on human life.
What do you mean?
During the Iran-Iraq War, the Ayatollah Khomeini sent waves of 12-year-old kids to clear minefields, promising them heaven. They actually wore keys around their necks, Michael. These thousands of young Iranian boys wore keys around their necks. The Ayatollah told them, these are the keys to heaven. You will die as martyrs and be with Allah.
Unbelievable.
So this is the mentality you have from that regime. This is not the days of mutually assured destruction where the Soviets didn't want to die, the U.S., we didn't want to die. Iran is fighting in their eyes for a greater good, for Allah. It's a very dangerous game. Sanctions will not work. When Israel strikes, I don't think it's a question of if anymore, Michael. I think it's a question of when Israel is forced to strike those Iranian nuclear facilities, because it has no other choice. I'll be really interested to see Obama's reaction. I think he's going to condemn Israel in the harshest terms publicly. Lord knows, in terms of sanctions, the UN, cutting military aid, I think this is an inherently anti-Israel president. Everything I've seen so far from his behavior towards Israel has led me to believe that, Michael. His outreach to the Muslim world. Michael, everything I saw before this man was elected showed me he would not be a friend of Israel, from his relationship with Reverend Wright to various Palestinian anti-Semites. It was obvious this guy was no fan of Israel. Now, as he is as president, it's shocking and dismaying treatment of perhaps our closest ally, long-term strategic ally, friendly nation, who faces the same enemy as us. What you're going to see is Obama moving towards a posture that we can contain a nuclear Iran. We will provide, and Hillary Clinton said this last year, Michael, if you remember, we can provide a nuclear umbrella for Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Israel, the Gulf states. That's going to be the caveat that Obama gives.
This is unbelievable to me.
This Iranian regime, they're not pragmatic. They're not rational. They are true believers in their mission. They cannot be contained. They're an expansionist, radical Shia state. What they say, when they talk about wiping Israel off the map, they mean it. When they call the U.S. the Great Satan, they mean it. And if they get their hands on nuclear weapons, they will use them. There's not a doubt in my mind. It might be 8 months, 12 months, 2 years. They will use them. They have to. It's part of their ideology. Their whole being, the whole existence of this Islamic regime is based on wiping out Israel, wiping out the West, wiping out every infidel regime that holds Iran back from reestablishing a new Persian empire.
Thanks for the report, Eric.
Michael, thanks again for having me on. Always a pleasure.